The sound of shattering porcelain cut through the room as Arthur Sterling deliberately pushed a $400 dinner plate off the edge of the table. He leaned back in his leather chair, a cold, mocking grin spreading across his face as he looked down at the chef standing before him. "Stick to cooking, boy," Arthur sneered, tossing his silk napkin onto the table. "It is actually hilarious how a black man in a white apron thinks he can comprehend a quantum algorithm." He leaned closer, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "Did you really think breathing the same air as billionaires makes you one of us? Your brain is built for following recipes, not formulas. Wipe the floor, take your little tip, and be grateful I even allow someone like you in my dining room. Now learn your place." But as the arrogant billionaire took another sip of his expensive champagne, he had absolutely no idea what he had just unleashed. He didn't know that the quiet, broad-shouldered man, kneeling to gather the broken shards, was less than an hour away from entirely destroying his $500 million empire with nothing but a dry erase marker. Do not scroll past this. You are going to want to witness the exact moment this billionaire's smirk gets wiped off his face forever. Drop a comment right now with your city and local time to lock your seat, and make sure to hit that subscribe button to join our community. The real show is about to begin. The grandeur was not just a restaurant. It was a fortress of wealth suspended 85 floors above the unforgiving concrete of Chicago. Inside its private dining room, the air smelled of white truffles, aged oak, and the kind of quiet power that only ungodly amounts of money could buy. Tonight, the room had been meticulously arranged for a closed-door pitch. The target, $500 million. The man demanding it, Arthur Sterling. Arthur was a tech billionaire whose reputation was built on ruthless acquisitions and a meticulously crafted image of intellectual superiority. He sat at the head of a sprawling mahogany table surrounded by 12 of the most formidable venture capitalists and risk analysts in the country, including Dr. Elias Vance, the chief risk analyst for the Vanguard Quantum Fund. They were gathered to witness the unveiling of Sterling's latest crown jewel, a supposedly impenetrable quantum encryption AI. The stakes were astronomical, and the atmosphere was thick with greed. Moving silently through the periphery of this gilded cage was Marcus Hayes. At 32, Marcus wore the crisp, white, double-breasted jacket of the executive chef, his broad shoulders moving with a quiet, practiced grace. To the men in the $10,000 suits sitting at the table, Marcus was invisible. He was the help, a black man whose only purpose in their universe was to ensure their Wagyu beef was seared to a flawless medium rare. They did not know that just 5 years ago, Marcus Hayes had been the shining star of Stanford University's Applied Mathematics PhD program. He had been a prodigy, a man who saw the world not in shapes and colors, but in fractals, topological variables, and multidimensional matrices. But brilliance does not pay hospital bills. When his daughter Lily was born with a severe and rare congenital heart defect, the academic stipends had barely covered the parking fees at the hospital. As the surgeries piled up, so did the debt. Marcus had to make a choice. He abandoned his dissertation, packed away his notebooks, and stepped into the grueling, high-pressure world of elite culinary kitchens, the only place that offered the immediate massive sign-on bonuses and premium platinum health insurance necessary to keep Lily's fragile heart beating. He traded his chalk for a chef's knife, swallowing his pride every single day for the 6-year-old girl currently lying in the intensive care unit at Chicago Memorial Hospital, waiting for a mechanical valve replacement. Tonight, Marcus was personally overseeing the service, ensuring every detail was perfect, so he wouldn't give the famously volatile Arthur Sterling any reason to complain. But Arthur was not looking for perfection. He was looking for dominance. As Marcus approached the table to pour a vintage 1982 Bordeaux into Arthur's crystal glass, the billionaire abruptly shifted his arm, deliberately, knocking the heavy bottle A splash of dark crimson wine cascaded down landing directly on Arthur's custom-made imported alligator leather shoes. The conversation around the table died instantly. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Marcus immediately stepped back, grabbing a pristine white linen towel. "My apologies, Mr. Sterling. Let me get that cleaned up for you immediately." Arthur did not look at the wine. He did not look at the table. He looked slowly, deliberately up at Marcus. His eyes were cold, dead, and utterly devoid of humanity. "You ruined a $10,000 pair of shoes, chef." Arthur said, his voice a low, theatrical whisper that carried perfectly across the silent room. "I assure you, sir, it was an accident. The restaurant will fully reimburse." "I don't want the restaurant's money," Arthur interrupted, leaning forward. He pointed a manicured finger at the floor. "Clean it." Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second. As the executive chef, it was entirely beneath his position to wipe a guest's shoes. But he knew the rules of the grandeur. The customer, especially a billionaire customer, was absolute law. Thinking of Lily's hospital bed, Marcus swallowed his pride. He slowly lowered himself, his knees hitting the hardwood floor, and began to gently dab the red wine from the expensive leather. Arthur took a sip of water, looking around the table at his investors, making sure he had their undivided attention. Then he looked down at Marcus, a cruel, satisfied smirk twisting his features. "Look at you," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Right where your kind belongs, at my feet." The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. A few of the investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one said a word. No one dared to correct the man who was about to make them all richer. Marcus's jaw tightened. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the towel. The humiliation burned in his chest, hot and violent, but he forced his hands to remain steady. He finished wiping the shoe, stood up slowly, and walked back to the kitchen without a single word. He had a job to do. He had a daughter to save. But the fire inside the former mathematician had just been lit. 15 minutes later, the lights in the private dining room dimmed. The massive panoramic windows overlooking the Chicago skyline were automatically shaded, and a state-of-the-art holographic projector hummed to life in the center of the table. Arthur Sterling stood at the head of the room, a laser pointer in his hand, looking every bit the visionary he desperately wanted the world to believe he was. "Gentlemen," Arthur began, his voice booming with rehearsed confidence. "For the past 3 years, my engineers have been developing a quantum encryption algorithm that will render all current cybersecurity obsolete. We call it the Aegis Protocol." The screen flashed, displaying sprawling, complex polynomial matrices interwoven with multi-dimensional topological graphs. It was a visual representation of the AI's core architecture. To the venture capitalists in the room, it was a beautiful, incomprehensible blur of numbers that represented $500 million in projected revenue. They nodded along as Arthur threw out buzzwords: quantum nodes, nonlinear lattice structures, dynamic cryptography. Marcus re-entered the room, leading a line of silent servers. He carried a silver tray, balancing 3 plates of pan-seared scallops garnished with gold leaf. He moved with the practiced invisibility of high-end service, stepping lightly, ensuring no clattering of silverware interrupted the billionaire's grand pitch. As Marcus set a plate down in front of Dr. Elias Vance, his eyes naturally drifted toward the massive projection screen. It had been 5 years since Marcus had looked at high-level mathematical architecture. 5 years of reading recipes instead of research papers. But a mind like his does not forget. It does not lose its edge. It merely sleeps. And right now, looking at the glowing blue equations of the Aegis Protocol, Marcus's mind woke up violently. He didn't just see numbers. He saw the geometry of the equations. He saw the structure. And almost instantly, he saw the fracture. Arthur was currently pointing to a specific block of code representing the topological variance of the encryption matrix. As you can see, the stability of the lattice structure is absolute. The recursive loop ensures that any brute force attack is instantly redirected into a null space. Marcus stopped walking. He stood completely still behind Dr. Vance's chair, his eyes locked on the screen. The tray in his hand lowered slightly. No, Marcus thought. That's wrong. The mapping is continuous, but the target space isn't compact. Under an extreme stress test, the nonlinear lattice won't redirect to a null space. It will collapse into an infinite loop. It's a vulnerability, a massive one. He blinked, running the complex mental arithmetic again. He integrated the variables, isolated the vectors, and traced the topological path in his head. The result was exactly the same. The algorithm wasn't just flawed, it was structurally compromised at its very foundation. If this system went live, whoever held the key to that specific vulnerability could bypass the entire encryption without triggering a single alarm. Marcus looked around the table. The investors were mesmerized. Dr. Vance was taking furious notes, clearly impressed by the sheer complexity of the presentation. They were about to hand Arthur Sterling $500 million for a system that was fundamentally broken. The internal conflict hit Marcus like a physical blow. Every instinct of survival screamed at him to turn around and walk back to the kitchen. "Walk away, Marcus." A voice in his head pleaded. "You are a chef. You need this job. If you get fired tonight, Lily loses her insurance. If Lily loses her insurance, she doesn't get the valve. She dies. Keep your mouth shut. Let the billionaires rob each other." He took a step backward toward the kitchen doors. But then he looked back at Arthur Sterling. He looked at the man who had just forced him to his knees, the man who had looked at him like he was an insect, the man who believed he was an untouchable god among men. Marcus Hayes was a father. He was a chef. But before all of that, he was a mathematician. And a true mathematician cannot simply walk away from a broken equation. He took a deep breath. He set his silver tray down on a side station. The metallic clink was soft, but in the quiet room it sounded like a gunshot. Marcus took 3 steps forward, moving past the servers, stepping directly into the light of the projector. He stood tall, his broad frame casting a shadow over the glowing equations. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a deep, resonant authority that demanded absolute attention. Arthur stopped mid-sentence. His laser pointer dropped. He turned to look at the chef, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. "What do you think you are doing?" Arthur hissed, the venom returning to his voice. "Get out of here." Marcus didn't blink. He didn't look at the ground. He looked Arthur Sterling dead in the eyes, his voice steady and perfectly clear. "The algorithm has a critical flaw." The room fell silent. It was not a casual silence. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. 30 pairs of eyes widened in utter disbelief, staring at the black chef in the white coat who had just interrupted a $500 million corporate presentation to critique quantum mathematics. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody dared to breathe. Then Arthur Sterling laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound that broke the tension, and immediately several of the investors joined in. It started as a low chuckle and quickly escalated into a chorus of mocking, arrogant laughter echoing off the expensive wood-paneled walls. "A flaw," Arthur repeated, wiping a fake tear from his eye. He leaned against the table, crossing his arms, looking at Marcus as if he were a particularly amusing court jester. "Let me get this straight. You, the guy whose greatest intellectual achievement of the day was properly searing a piece of fish, are telling me that my team of MIT PhDs made a mistake." Marcus stood his ground, his face impassive. "I am telling you that the topological mapping in your variance block is unstable. It's a vulnerability. The laughter from the investors grew louder. Oh, I see. Arthur clapped his hands together sarcastically. Did the culinary school start teaching trigonometry while you were chopping onions? Tell me, chef, how exactly does one factor a polynomial matrix while making a béarnaise sauce? Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the dining room flew open. Mr. Arrington, the general manager of the grandeur, rushed in his face, completely drained of blood. He had been monitoring the room through the security cameras and had sprinted all the way from his office. Mr. Sterling, gentlemen, I am so incredibly sorry. Arrington gasped, practically throwing himself between Marcus and the table. He turned on Marcus, his eyes wide with panic and fury. What is wrong with you? Have you lost your mind? Apologize to Mr. Sterling and get out of this room right now. Mr. Arrington, they are about to invest in a broken system, Marcus said calmly. I don't care if they are investing in magic beans, Arrington hissed, grabbing Marcus by the arm and trying to pull him away. You are a chef. You do not speak to the guests. Do you know what you've done? You're fired, Marcus. You are done. Arrington then turned back to Arthur, bowing his head in total submission. Please, Mr. Sterling, I beg you to forgive this intrusion. The man is under immense stress. His daughter, she's in the ICU right now at Memorial. Her heart is failing. He's desperate for the money and the insurance. He's just not thinking straight. Please don't let this ruin your evening. The manager meant well. He thought that by revealing Marcus's tragic circumstances, he could invoke some sympathy, perhaps prevent a lawsuit against the restaurant. But Arthur Sterling did not possess sympathy. He possessed malice. The billionaire's smile faded, replaced by a look of profound, chilling disgust. He stepped closer to Marcus, invading his personal space, looking him up and down. In the ICU, huh? Arthur said softly. The room was dead silent again, every investor hanging onto his words. Arthur sighed, shaking his head. You know, this is exactly what is wrong with society today. We waste millions of dollars trying to artificially prop up lives that were never meant to survive. Marcus's entire body went rigid. His breath caught in his throat. Arthur leaned in, his voice dropping to a vicious, cruel whisper, meant only for Marcus, though in the quiet room it carried to the front row of investors. Nature has a way of weeding out the weak chef, Arthur said, his eyes practically glowing with cruelty. Your daughter's defective heart is just biology correcting a mistake. Why should the world fund a lost cause? Why should we pay to keep defective genetics in the gene pool? The words struck Marcus like a physical blow. The insult to himself he could take. The racism, the classism, the spilled wine, he could swallow all of it. But Lily, his sweet, innocent Lily, fighting for her life in a cold hospital room while this monster stood here calling her a biological mistake. Something deep inside Marcus Hayes snapped. The heavy chains of self-restraint forged over 5 years of subservience shattered completely. The fear of losing his job vanished. The fear of eviction vanished. There was nothing left in Marcus's eyes but the cold, terrifying clarity of a genius who had just been pushed past the point of no return. Marcus gently but firmly removed Mr. Arrington's hand from his arm. He stepped past the manager, closing the distance between himself and Arthur Sterling until they were inches apart. Marcus did not yell. He did not raise his fist. He simply looked down at the billionaire, and when he spoke, his voice was so incredibly cold, it made the hair on Dr. Vance's arms stand up. Your algorithm isn't just mathematically flawed, Sterling, Marcus said, his voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. It's fraudulent, and I can prove it. The word fraudulent was not a word Arthur Sterling was accustomed to hearing. It was a word that billionaires paid armies of corporate lawyers to permanently eradicate from the public record. To hear it spoken in his own private dining room in front of his primary investors by a black man wearing a stained chef's uniform was an anomaly his massive, fragile ego simply could not process. The room remained entirely paralyzed. The 12 venture capitalists' men who collectively controlled hundreds of billions of dollars in global assets sat perfectly still. Dr. Elias Vance, the chief risk analyst for the Vanguard Fund, slowly adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his keen eyes darting between the furious billionaire and the remarkably calm chef. Vance had spent 20 years navigating the treacherous waters of Silicon Valley and Wall Street. He knew the look of a desperate man making empty threats, and he knew the look of a man who possessed absolute, unshakable certainty. Marcus Hayes did not look desperate. He looked terrifyingly certain. "Mr. Sterling, I will call security immediately," Mr. Arrington stammered, his voice trembling violently as he reached for the discreet earpiece hidden beneath his collar. "This man is clearly having a psychotic break. We will have him removed, arrested for trespassing, and charged with corporate disturbance." "Shut up, Arrington," Arthur snapped, not taking his eyes off Marcus for a single second. His voice was no longer a loud, theatrical boom. It was a deadly, venomous hiss. "If you call security right now, I will buy this restaurant tomorrow morning and fire you before you even finish your morning coffee. Do not interrupt me again." Arrington swallowed hard, a visible bead of sweat rolling down his temple, and backed away, literally shrinking against the expensive mahogany-paneled wall. Arthur stepped closer to Marcus. The physical height difference between the two men was marginal, but Marcus's broad, kitchen-hardened shoulders made the tech billionaire look fragile by comparison. Yet Arthur possessed the weaponized confidence of a man who truly believed his bank account made him an untouchable god among mortals. Fraudulent Arthur repeated, tasting the word, letting it roll off his tongue with a toxic mix of dark amusement and homicidal rage. "You walk into my private pitch, you ruin my custom shoes, you disrupt a $500 million financial negotiation, and you have the audacity to call my life's work fraudulent. A black cook, a man who flips steaks and washes pans for a living, is going to lecture Arthur Sterling on quantum topology." "I am not lecturing you, Mr. Sterling." Marcus replied, his voice an even, unyielding baritone that commanded the space. "I am simply stating a mathematical fact. The recursive loop in your variance block is intentionally masking an infinite collapse. You are selling these men a broken vault." A low murmur rippled through the sprawling table. Dr. Vance leaned forward, his heavy gold pen hovering over his leather notepad. The specific terminology Marcus used, recursive loop variance block infinite collapse. These were not corporate buzzwords pulled from a magazine. They were hyper-specific, advanced diagnostic terms. Arthur heard the murmur. He felt the infinitesimal shift in the room's atmosphere. The powerful investors were no longer just laughing at a crazy, desperate chef. A microscopic seed of doubt had just been planted in their minds. For a man trying to secure $500 million in liquid capital, doubt was a fatal poison. Arthur knew he couldn't just have Marcus dragged out by security now. If Marcus left in handcuffs without being proven definitively wrong, that seed of doubt would grow. The investors would demand a third-party audit. The Aegis protocol would be delayed, intensely investigated, and ultimately exposed for what it really was. Arthur had to destroy him. He had to humiliate this chef so profoundly, so publicly, and devastatingly that no one in this room would ever remember the word fraudulent without bursting into laughter. "You know," Arthur said, his lips curling into a deeply predatory smile, "I was going to let you go. I was going to let you walk back to your miserable little kitchen and keep your miserable little job so you could pay to keep your defective child breathing for a few more meaningless days. But you just had to play the hero, didn't you? You just couldn't stick to cooking." Arthur turned sharply to his tech team, who were standing nervously by the holographic projector. "Bring up the core encryption matrix," he barked. "The raw architecture. Put it on the digital whiteboard right now." The lead engineer hesitated, his hands shaking over the keyboard. "Sir, that's our proprietary source code. We haven't patented the inner layers of the—" "Do it!" Arthur roared, his face flushing a violent shade of crimson. The engineer scrambled to hit the keys. The beautiful, consumer-friendly holographic projection of the AI vanished. In its place, the massive smart whiteboard spanning the entire back wall of the dining room illuminated with a harsh white glare. It was instantly filled with thousands of lines of raw, uncompiled mathematical architecture. It was a monstrous, terrifying labyrinth of advanced calculus, nonlinear topology, and multidimensional matrices. To 99.9% of the human population, it looked like absolute alien gibberish. To the investors in the room, it looked overwhelmingly complex, reinforcing their initial belief in its $500 million value. Arthur walked over to the whiteboard tray, grabbed a thick, black, dry erase marker, and turned back to Marcus, weighing the plastic cylinder in his hand. "You want to play the genius, boy?" Arthur sneered deliberately, using the racial diminutive with calculated, piercing malice. "You want to stand in front of the most powerful men in this city and claim your culinary brain can read quantum architecture." Without warning, Arthur cocked his arm back and threw the marker as hard as he could. It struck Marcus squarely in the chest, leaving a faint black smudge on his pristine white chef's coat before clattering loudly onto the hardwood floor. "Solve it," Arthur demanded, his voice echoing fiercely in the silent room. "Show us the flaw. Point out the exact topological fracture you claim is there." Marcus looked down at the black marker on the floor. He didn't flinch. He didn't move a muscle. Arthur spread his arms wide, addressing the room, playing to his wealthy audience. "Look at him, gentlemen. The great culinary mathematician is suddenly silent. What's wrong, chef? Is the board missing a recipe for mashed potatoes? Can't find the garlic powder hidden in the algorithm?" A few of the investors chuckled nervously, eager to side with the billionaire and break the uncomfortable tension. "You have 30 seconds, Arthur said, dropping the theatrical tone, his voice turning into ice-cold steel. "You pick up that marker, or I swear to God, I will personally ensure you never work in this city again. I will make sure your daughter's hospital bed is emptied by tomorrow morning. I will destroy you." Marcus slowly lowered his gaze from Arthur's face to the black marker lying on the floor. The threats against his own career meant absolutely nothing, but the threat against Lily, that was the final trigger. Marcus closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He remembered the rhythmic beep of Lily's heart monitor. He remembered her small, fragile hand holding his, trusting him to keep her safe. When Marcus opened his eyes, the humble chef was gone. The Stanford mathematician had awakened. The dry erase marker lay on the polished hardwood floor, a small cylinder of black plastic that suddenly felt like the heaviest object in the room. Arthur Sterling looked down at it, then up at Marcus, his ego inflating to grotesque proportions. He misread the chef's silence as total, paralyzing fear. To a predator like Arthur, fear was blood in the water. "Nothing to say," Arthur taunted, walking slowly around the edge of the sprawling mahogany table. He picked up his crystal champagne flute, taking a casual, agonizingly slow sip. "That is what I thought. You people are all the same. Big talk, loud mouths, but the second you are asked to back it up with actual intellect, you freeze. You are intellectually bankrupt." Marcus kept his eyes locked on Arthur's face. He did not look at the marker. He did not look at the floor. The anger inside him was no longer a hot, chaotic flame. It had compressed into something freezing cold and infinitely sharp. "Let's make this interesting, shall we?" Arthur purred, setting his glass down with a sharp clink. He turned to the 12 investors, spreading his arms. "Gentlemen, I am a man of wagers. I believe in putting your money where your mouth is. So let's offer our arrogant chef here a little motivation." Arthur turned back to Marcus, the malicious glee in his eyes fully illuminated by the harsh white glare of the digital whiteboard behind him. "Here is the deal, boy," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, ringing out with terrifying clarity. "You pick up that marker. You step up to this board and you prove to this room that my $500 million algorithm is fraudulent. You find the exact topological fracture you claim exists. If you do that, if you actually manage to prove my MIT engineers wrong, I will pull out my checkbook and write you a personal check for $1 million right here, right now." A collective gasp echoed through the room. $1 million. For a man drowning in medical debt, it was a lifeline from the heavens. It was the exact cost of Lily's mechanical valve replacement, post-operative care, and 5 years of premium health insurance. But Arthur wasn't finished. However, Arthur continued, his smile turning into a razor-thin line of pure sociopathic cruelty. "When you fail, and you will fail because you are nothing but a glorified line cook, the consequences will be biblical." Arthur took a step closer, his breath smelling of alcohol and malice. "When you fail, I will make a phone call. I will purchase your daughter's medical debt from Chicago Memorial Hospital tonight. And by midnight, I will personally ensure she is discharged. I will have her bed wheeled out of the intensive care unit and dumped onto the cold pavement of the street." Dr. Elias Vance flinched visibly. Another investor at the far end of the table, a man with silver hair, opened his mouth to protest. "Arthur, for God's sake, that is a child." "Quiet," Arthur roared, slamming his fist onto the table. "This is my pitch. This is my room. This piece of garbage insulted my life's work, and he will pay the price." Arthur turned his dead, shark-like eyes back to Marcus. "I will throw her on the street, chef. Unless you get down on your hands and knees right now, crawl over to where you spilled my wine, and lick it off the floor like the dog you are. You lick it clean, you beg for my forgiveness, and maybe, just maybe, I will let your defective kid keep breathing." The room plunged into an abyss of horrific silence. The cruelty was so immense, so vividly abhorrent, that it suffocated the oxygen in the air. The investors looked away, ashamed, disgusted, yet entirely complicit in their silence. No one moved. No one dared to challenge the billionaire with the $500 million key to the future. Marcus Hayes stood perfectly still. The threats echoed in his ears: lick the floor, defective kid, dumped onto the street. For a man who had spent the last 5 years suppressing his pride, swallowing insults, and bowing his head to survive, this was the absolute end of the line. The chef who had walked into the room 10 minutes ago was dead. Marcus slowly looked down at the black marker on the floor. He bent his knees, his broad shoulders dropping gracefully, and picked it up. The plastic felt cold against his calloused skin. He stood up, standing at his full height of 6'2", towering over Arthur Sterling. Marcus did not yell. He did not curse. Instead, he reached around his waist, grabbing the knot of his apron. With a swift, deliberate pull, Marcus untied his pristine, double-breasted white apron. The heavy white fabric loosened around his waist. He slipped it over his head, folding the bright white garment once in his hands, and calmly placed it over the back of an empty leather dining chair. Underneath, Marcus wore a simple black undershirt that clung tightly to his muscular frame. He slowly rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms covered in the shiny, faded burn scars of a man who had spent thousands of hours over open commercial flames. He gripped the black marker in his right hand. Without casting a single glance at Arthur, Mr. Arrington, or the trembling investors, Marcus walked past the billionaire and stepped directly in front of the blindingly bright digital whiteboard. Thousands of lines of non-linear lattice structures and dynamic cryptography stared back at him. It was a digital fortress designed to intimidate, to confuse, to break the minds of lesser mathematicians. Marcus stared at the board. For 3 seconds, he did nothing. Arthur smirked, leaning back ready to deliver his final crushing insult. "What's the matter, chef? Can't find the—" Marcus uncapped the marker. The sharp chemical smell of dry erase ink hit the air. He raised his hand to the board, pressed the felt tip against the glass, and began to write. The black marker hit the digital whiteboard with a sharp, definitive clack. For the first few seconds, the room watched with a collective sense of morbid curiosity. Arthur Sterling stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his tailored suit, his mocking grin etched deeply into his features. He was fully expecting the chef to draw a stick figure, scribble a recipe for hollandaise sauce, or simply break down crying under the crushing pressure. But Marcus did not cry. He wrote. He started at the top left corner of the massive screen, bypassing the visual user interface and digging straight into the raw, unforgiving, algebraic geometry of the source code. His handwriting was not the messy, panicked scrawl of a desperate man. It was sharp, precise, and violently fast. He began by isolating the quantum nodes. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The sound of the felt tip marker was the only noise in the cavernous private dining room. Marcus moved across the board, his eyes tracking lines of code that would make a seasoned Silicon Valley programmer dizzy. He pulled down the polynomial matrices, factoring them in real time, holding impossibly complex variables in his head, without pausing to double-check his work. He was not just reading the code. He was dissecting it, peeling back the layers of Arthur Sterling's $500 million armor, like a trauma surgeon opening a chest cavity. Minute 1 passed. Arthur's smirk remained, though the edges of it had stiffened slightly. "Gibberish," the billionaire muttered to the room, though his voice lacked its previous booming confidence. "He's just copying symbols to buy time." But Dr. Elias Vance, sitting at the center of the mahogany table, knew it was not gibberish. Vance was a man who held 2 PhDs from MIT. He had spent his entire adult life evaluating the most complex risk algorithms on the planet. As Marcus's marker flew across the board, Vance's posture began to change. He uncrossed his legs. He leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on the table, his eyes narrowing as he tried to follow the chef's rapid-fire logic. Marcus was setting up a non-linear manifold projection. It was an insanely complex mathematical method used to test the boundary limits of topological spaces. It was not something you learned in a standard college calculus class, and it certainly wasn't something you picked up in culinary school. It was the kind of elite theoretical mathematics discussed exclusively in closed-door doctoral seminars at Stanford and Princeton. "He's mapping the recursive loop," Vance realized, a cold prickle of sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. My God, he's actually mapping the continuous variables in his head. Marcus's hand moved faster. The black ink slashed ruthlessly through Arthur's pristine white code. He crossed out 3 lines of dynamic cryptography, drew a sharp arrow down to the lower quadrant, and began to rewrite the fundamental topological variants. Every stroke of the pen was fueled by the rhythmic beep of Lily's heart monitor, echoing in his memory. Every equation solved was a step closer to keeping his little girl alive. The adrenaline and the math merged into a state of absolute hyper-focused flow. The rhythm of the marker grew rapid and dawned intense. It was a percussion of pure, unadulterated genius. Clack, squeak, slash. Arthur Sterling's arms slowly uncrossed. The arrogant, sociopathic glee in his eyes began to flicker, replaced by a microscopic, deeply buried spark of confusion. He looked at his lead engineer, who was standing rigidly by the holographic projector. The engineer was completely frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open, his eyes wide with a terror that Arthur did not yet comprehend. "What is he doing?" Arthur hissed at the engineer, stepping closer. "Tell me he's just writing nonsense." The engineer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Sir, he's reverse engineering the core encryption in real time." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. The investors, who had been leaning back in their chairs, enjoying the cruel entertainment, suddenly sat bolt upright. The mocking, elitist energy that had filled the room evaporated instantly. The room fell silent. It was a completely different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of shock or pity. It was the breathless, terrifying silence of witnessing an absolute impossibility unfold before their very eyes. Nobody dared to breathe. Marcus did not stop. He didn't even blink. He reached the bottom of the first panel, his black undershirt clinging to his muscular back with sweat. The burn scars on his forearms flexed as he stepped sideways to the second panel and continued the proof. He was hunting the flaw, the fracture he had seen from across the room while carrying a tray of scallops. Dr. Vance pushed his chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor, but nobody looked at him. Everyone was completely hypnotized by the broad-shouldered black man in the center of the room. Vance stood up. He couldn't help himself. He walked slowly toward the board, his hands trembling slightly as he read the equations Marcus was leaving in his wake. It was flawless. It was the most elegant, devastatingly brutal mathematical takedown Vance had ever seen in his 20-year career. "He's collapsing the vector space," Vance whispered out loud, speaking to no one in particular. His face went pale. All the blood drained from his cheeks as the horrifying financial reality of what he was reading set in. The target space isn't compact. The lattice doesn't redirect the cyber attack. It breaks. Arthur Sterling whipped his head around, staring at the esteemed risk analyst. "Vance, what are you talking about?" "Stop him." "I can't." Vance breathed, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at Arthur, and for the first time all evening, the billionaire saw genuine, unadulterated fear. "Arthur, he is unraveling the entire system. Your $500 million shield is made of paper." Marcus reached the final quadrant of the digital whiteboard. He was breathing heavily now, the physical exertion of moving so fast, matching the intense mental marathon he was running. He had isolated the variance block, the exact location where the AI was supposed to be impenetrable. Arthur took a frantic step forward, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Stop writing," he shouted, his voice cracking with a sudden, wildly uncharacteristic panic. "Security, Arrington, get in here and grab him." But nobody moved. The investors were completely paralyzed, their eyes glued to the board. Mr. Arrington was frozen by the door, utterly bewildered. Marcus ignored the shouting. He raised the black marker for the final sequence. He stared at the last three variables hidden deep within the code, preparing to expose the mathematical error that would render the algorithm useless. But as his eyes scanned the final polynomial sequence, his marker hovered in the air. He stopped writing. He stood perfectly still, staring at the board. The sudden cessation of the marker's squeak was louder than a gunshot in the silent room. Marcus turned his head slowly, looking past the digital screen, past Dr. Vance, and locked his piercing eyes directly with Arthur Sterling. The flaw wasn't an accident. The marker hovered frozen in the air. The relentless rhythmic squeaking that had dominated the room for the last 10 minutes abruptly stopped. Marcus Hayes stood motionless before the blinding white glare of the digital whiteboard, his broad chest rising and falling as he stared at the final sequence of the code. He didn't step back. He didn't cap the marker. He just stood there, his brilliant mind processing a revelation so dark, so maliciously calculated, that it momentarily eclipsed the rage he felt toward Arthur Sterling. The heavy, suffocating silence returned to the private dining room. The investors exchanged nervous, bewildered glances. Dr. Elias Vance, standing just a few feet away from Marcus, leaned in closer, his breath hitching in his throat, as he tried to anticipate what the chef had found. Arthur Sterling forced a strained, hollow laugh. The confident, booming voice of the tech visionary was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, reedy pitch. "Well, what is it, chef? Did you forget how to carry the one? Did the math get a little too complicated for a man who spends his days seasoning meat?" Marcus didn't immediately answer. He slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto Arthur, with a look of absolute, chilling clarity. It wasn't the look of a man who had been defeated. It was the look of a judge who had just read a guilty verdict. "I initially thought your engineering team was simply incompetent," Marcus said, his deep baritone voice resonating through the tense air of the dining room. He turned back to the board. "I thought this topological fracture was a structural oversight, a failure to close the recursive loop properly due to lazy mathematics." Marcus raised the black marker. He didn't cross anything out this time. Instead, he drew a massive, deliberate circle around a dense cluster of 3 polynomial variables hidden at the very bottom quadrant of the matrix. He tapped the glass inside the circle twice. Tap. Tap. "But I was wrong," Marcus declared, stepping aside so the entire room and specifically Dr. Vance could see the circled equation. "This isn't an error. It isn't a bug. This is a conditionally programmed bypass." Arthur's face twitched. That's absurd. It's a dynamic stabilization protocol. It is a cryptographic backdoor." Marcus interrupted, his voice slicing through Arthur's lie with surgical precision. The room fell silent. Even the ice melting in the crystal water glasses seemed to freeze. Marcus turned to address the 12 venture capitalists sitting at the mahogany table. "If this system goes live and receives a targeted high-density quantum stress input, say a simulated cyber attack, the lattice structure doesn't redirect the threat into a null space like Mr. Sterling claimed. Instead, this specific equation right here acts as a localized black hole." Dr. Vance took a step closer to the board. His eyes darted frantically across the equations Marcus had mapped out, tracing the non-linear pathways, doing the asymptotic expansions in his head. "What does that mean exactly?" asked the silver-haired investor at the far end of the table, his voice laced with sudden, sharp suspicion. "It means," Marcus explained, pointing the marker directly at Arthur, "that the moment you wire your $500 million into the Aegis Protocol's operational ledger, this subroutine is designed to trigger. It will automatically bypass all external security measures, collapse the internal ledger, and funnel every single cent of your investment into untraceable, decentralized offshore routing accounts." The words detonated inside the room like a bomb. "He's lying!" Arthur shouted, his voice cracking violently. He stepped forward, waving his arms in a frantic, disjointed motion. "This is corporate sabotage. He has no idea what he's talking about. It's absolute gibberish from a disgruntled, psychotic waiter." "Elias," the silver-haired investor demanded, standing up from his chair. "Elias, tell me he is making this up. Tell me we aren't looking at an automated heist." Dr. Elias Vance did not answer immediately. He was standing mere inches from the digital screen. His hands, usually so steady, were visibly shaking. He traced Marcus's black ink with his index finger, following the logical flow of the mathematics from the variance block down to the backdoor override. He checked the variables. He checked the topological boundary limits. He checked the vector space collapse. It was undeniable. It was mathematically absolute. Vance slowly turned around to face the table. All the color had completely drained from his face. He went pale, a ghastly, sickly shade of white. "Oh my God!" Vance whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of sheer terror and profound awe. He looked at the other investors, his eyes wide and horrified. "He is absolutely right." Pandemonium erupted. Chairs scraped violently against the hardwood floor as several billionaires jumped to their feet. The refined, elite atmosphere of the private dining room shattered instantly, replaced by the primal, aggressive roar of incredibly powerful men who had just realized they were seconds away from being robbed blind. "You son of a bitch!" shouted a tech mogul from Silicon Valley, pointing a shaking finger at Arthur. "You were going to steal $500 million from us." "No, no, no, listen to me." Arthur panicked, backing up until his spine hit the edge of the dining table. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The untouchable god of the tech world was suddenly shrinking into a pathetic, cornered rat. He looked at his lead engineer, pointing frantically. "I didn't know? If there's a back door, my engineers must have coded it. They went rogue. I am the CEO. I don't write the day-to-day code." The lead engineer's jaw dropped in betrayal, but before he could even defend himself, Marcus's voice boomed over the chaos. "Save it, Sterling," Marcus commanded. He stepped forward, tossing the black marker onto the tray. It clattered loudly, a final punctuation to his mathematical masterpiece. "Look at the bypass trigger. The conditional override requires a primary executive cryptographic key to activate. A key that, according to your own prospectus, is held only by the founder." Marcus stepped into Arthur's personal space. The billionaire was sweating profusely, his custom suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for his trembling frame. "You built a $500 million mousetrap," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that only Arthur and Vance could fully hear. "And you thought you could use me as a prop. You thought you could humiliate me, mock my daughter's life, and use my degradation as entertainment while you robbed these men blind." Arthur opened his mouth, but no words came out. His lips quivered. The cold, mocking smirk that had ordered a father to lick wine off the floor was gone, replaced by the absolute crushing reality of his own destruction. Marcus looked down at the shaking billionaire, his eyes burning with the quiet, dignified fire of a man who had just reclaimed his soul. At the far end of the table, a quiet man in a tailored navy suit, a man who had barely spoken all evening, calmly pulled a specialized encrypted phone from his jacket pocket. He was not a venture capitalist. He was a covert federal inspector for the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, invited to the pitch to ensure regulatory compliance. He dialed a number, his eyes locked dead onto Arthur Sterling. The real consequences were about to begin. The quiet man in the tailored navy suit pressed his encrypted phone to his ear, his voice cutting through the chaotic roar of the dining room with absolute terrifying authority. "This is Special Agent Thomas Reed, Securities and Exchange Commission Enforcement Division," he said, holding up a gold federal badge that caught the harsh light of the digital whiteboard. "Execute immediate injunction code red. Freeze all corporate assets linked to Arthur Sterling, the Aegis Protocol, and Sterling Vanguard. Lock down the servers in Palo Alto and contact the FBI field office to dispatch a raid team to his primary residence. We have a confirmed 10B-5 securities fraud in progress." Arthur Sterling's eyes widened to the size of saucers. All the blood rushed from his head. He went pale, a sickly, translucent white that made him look like a walking corpse. "Wait! Wait, Tom, stop!" Arthur gasped, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeal. He lunged across the mahogany table, knocking over crystal water glasses, desperately reaching out toward the federal agent. "It is a misunderstanding, a glitch. You can't do this based on the scribblings of a cook." Agent Reed did not even blink. He smoothly stepped back, easily avoiding Arthur's frantic grasp. "The technical analysis was confirmed by Dr. Elias Vance on live record, Mr. Sterling. Your servers are being seized as we speak. I suggest you sit down and remain silent until federal marshals arrive." Arthur stumbled backward. His hands trembled violently. He looked around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for a single ally. But the 12 billionaires who had worshipped him just 20 minutes ago now looked at him as if he were a rabid dog. These were men who ruined lives for sport. They did not take kindly to being the marks of a con. William Thorne, the silver-haired venture capitalist, slammed his leather portfolio shut with a resounding crack. "You arrogant, stupid son of a bitch!" Thorne snarled, his voice vibrating with pure rage. "You really thought you could pull a $500 million wire fraud while we sat in the same room? My legal team is going to strip you down to the marrow, Arthur. When the federal government is done with you, I will personally take whatever is left." "William, please." Arthur begged, his knees actually buckling slightly. The $10,000 custom alligator shoes, still stained with the wine he had forced Marcus to wipe, slipped awkwardly on the polished hardwood floor. "I didn't know it was the engineers." Arthur turned wildly to where his tech team had been standing, but the space was empty. The lead engineer and the holographic technicians had already bolted out the service doors, frantically calling their own lawyers. Arthur was completely, utterly alone. Dr. Elias Vance stood by the whiteboard, still staring at the mathematical masterpiece Marcus had left behind. He slowly turned his head to look at Arthur. "There is no glitch, Arthur," Vance said, his voice laced with profound disgust. "The mathematical architecture required to build that back door is deliberate. It is malicious. You sat there and mocked this man's intelligence. You mocked his sick child while you were actively trying to steal our money. You are not a visionary. You are a common thief." Arthur's chest heaved. He was hyperventilating. The untouchable god of Silicon Valley was having a full-blown panic attack. He grabbed the edge of the table to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The empire he had spent a decade building had just been incinerated in exactly 14 minutes by a man holding a dry erase marker. The room fell silent again, but this time it was the heavy, inevitable silence of an execution. Then Marcus Hayes moved. He stepped away from the glaring light of the digital whiteboard, walking slowly, deliberately, until he was standing just a few feet away from the trembling billionaire. The physical contrast between the two men was staggering. Arthur was a hyperventilating, sweaty, broken mess. Marcus was a pillar of absolute, immovable stone. Marcus did not yell. He did not gloat. He did not let the anger consume him. He simply stood tall, looking down at the man who had threatened to throw his dying daughter onto the street. "You are going to prison, Mr. Sterling," Marcus said quietly. His deep, resonant voice carried a weight that demanded the attention of every single billionaire in the room. "The SEC will take your companies. The federal government will take your freedom. But before any of that happens," Marcus paused. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a standard, cheap, blue ballpoint pen, clicking it once. "You made a wager." Arthur stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. What are you talking about?" "A bet," William Thorne interrupted, stepping up to stand beside Marcus. The powerful billionaire investor looked at the black chef with a newfound, profound respect. "I heard it. We all heard it. You made a verbal, legally binding wager in front of 14 witnesses, including a federal agent." Agent Reed nodded slowly, folding his arms. "A verbal contract involving a $1 million payout for proving the algorithm was flawed. The terms were met flawlessly. My accounts," Arthur stammered, his eyes darting frantically. "They're frozen. The SEC just froze everything. Corporate accounts are frozen." "Mr. Sterling," Agent Reed corrected coldly, checking his watch. "The injunction on your personal offshore accounts will take approximately 4 minutes to clear the international landscaping protocols. You have a window. I suggest you use it." "Write the check, Arthur," Dr. Vance commanded, his voice echoing like thunder in the room. Arthur Sterling was cornered. There was no manipulation left, no lies to spin. He was surrounded by the most powerful men in the country, a federal agent and a mathematical genius who had just completely outclassed him. Shaking uncontrollably, Arthur reached into the breast pocket of his ruined suit and pulled out a slim black leather checkbook. His hands trembled so violently that he could barely uncap his fountain pen. He leaned over the mahogany table, resting the checkbook on the polished wood. The scratching sound of the expensive nib against the paper was the only sound in the room. $1 million. He signed his name, the signature messy and frantic. With a shaky, defeated breath, he tore the check from the binding. He didn't have the courage to look Marcus in the eye. He simply held it out, his hand suspended in the air, a pathetic monument to his shattered ego. Marcus reached out and took the check. He didn't snatch it. He took it gently, smoothly, his calloused fingers grazing the crisp paper. He looked at the ink, verifying the amount, verifying the signature. It was Lily's heart. It was her future. It was everything. Marcus folded the check once and slid it into the front pocket of his black undershirt. He looked the broken, sweating billionaire directly in the eyes. "I believe you owe me $1 million, Marcus said calmly. Debt paid. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room suddenly burst open. 2 uniformed federal marshals and 3 SEC enforcement officers stormed in their silver badges, flashing under the ambient lighting of the restaurant. They completely bypassed the stunned general manager, Mr. Arrington, who was currently hyperventilating against the wall, and walked with uncompromising authority straight toward the head of the mahogany table. Arthur Sterling did not resist. He didn't even have the physical strength left in his body to stand up. He collapsed backward into his luxurious leather chair. His $10,000 alligator shoes completely ruined his tailored designer suit, drenched in a cold, terrified sweat. As the federal officers read him his Miranda rights and forcefully pulled his arms behind his back, the sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent room. That sound was the final, definitive punctuation mark on the death of a billionaire's empire. Arthur was hauled roughly to his feet, a hollow, pathetic shell of the arrogant tyrant who had demanded a father lick wine off the floor just 20 minutes prior. As he was marched past, Marcus Arthur kept his eyes glued to the hardwood floor, utterly humiliated, unable to look up at the man who had just dismantled his entire life and legacy. The room exhaled a collective heavy breath as the doors closed behind the disgraced CEO. William Thorne, the silver-haired venture capitalist, turned his attention away from the doors and back to Marcus Hayes. He buttoned his suit jacket, stepped forward, and extended a firm, deeply respectful hand. "Mr. Hayes," Thorne said, his tone entirely devoid of the previous elitist arrogance that had poisoned the room all evening. "What you just did. I have been in the financial industry for 40 years, and I have never seen a mind deconstruct a multidimensional topological matrix with such terrifying, elegant precision. You just saved this room $500 million. Marcus looked at the extended hand. He didn't immediately take it. He remembered how these exact same men had sat in absolute silence, ready to laugh and be entertained when Arthur had ruthlessly mocked his dying daughter. Thorne saw the hesitation in Marcus's eyes and slowly nodded, dropping his hand, accepting the unspoken, heavy rebuke. "We were cowards," Dr. Elias Vance said, stepping up beside Thorne. The esteemed MIT risk analyst looked at Marcus with profound, unadulterated awe. "We let a monster insult you because he held the keys to a fortune. We were complicit in his cruelty, Marcus. I am deeply, profoundly sorry." Marcus gave a slow, single nod, accepting the apology. He wasn't looking for their friendship. He was looking for respect, and he had just carved it out of their very souls with a dry erase marker. "Mr. Hayes," Vance continued, his voice trembling with genuine academic excitement, "a mind like yours does not belong hidden away in a commercial kitchen. It is an absolute tragedy to humanity that you are holding a chef's knife instead of a pen. Vanguard Quantum Fund is currently restructuring our entire internal risk assessment division. We need a new director of risk analysis. We need someone who can see the fractures that no one else can see. The starting base salary is $3.5 million a year, with full, unconditional platinum medical coverage for you and your entire family effective immediately. By the doorway, the restaurant manager, Arrington, let out a pathetic, strangled squeak. The black chef he had fired and threatened to ruin just 10 minutes ago was now being offered a multi-million-dollar executive position by the most powerful financial titans in Chicago. Marcus stood silent, letting the staggering magnitude of the offer wash over him. $3.5 million a year. Full, unconditional medical coverage. He thought of the small, sterile hospital room at Chicago Memorial. He thought of Lily, her tiny chest rising and falling to the mechanical rhythm of a ventilator. He thought of the folded piece of paper resting in his pocket, $1 million, in pure, undeniable salvation. He wouldn't have to choose between paying the electric bill or buying her medication ever again. He wouldn't have to bow his head to arrogant men who saw him as nothing more than the color of his skin or the uniform on his back. He had walked into the ultimate fire, and he had emerged completely victorious. A slow, quiet smile spread across Marcus's face. It was the first time he had smiled all evening. The heavy, crushing weight of debt and fear that had sat on his shoulders for 5 agonizing years finally dissolved into the cold night air. I will have my lawyer review the employment contract on Monday morning. Dr. Vance, Marcus replied, his voice calm, steady, and full of a newfound, unshakable authority. We will have it drafted and waiting on your desk. Mr. Hayes, Vance said, beaming with intense relief and respect. Marcus turned around to face the digital whiteboard one last time. The blinding white screen was still covered in his chaotic, brilliant black ink, a beautiful, devastating monument to his intellect. He looked down at his hands. His knuckles were tight, and his fingertips were heavily stained with the thick, dark ink of the dry erase marker. With a calm, deliberate motion, Marcus casually wiped his inky-stained fingers on the front of his black apron, cleaning the residue off his hands. He smoothed out the dark black fabric tied securely around his waist, adjusting the strings slightly. He took one final sweeping look at the silenced room of billionaires, the glowing equations, and the spot on the floor where Arthur Sterling had tried to break his spirit. They would never, ever forget his name. Marcus turned his back on the private dining room and walked out the heavy oak doors. He walked past the stunned servers, past the frantic manager who shrank against the wall, and stepped into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, separating him from the world of the elite, Marcus placed a hand over his chest pocket, feeling the crisp edge of the $1 million check. Tomorrow morning, his little girl was getting a new heart. And Marcus Hayes was finally getting his life back. True brilliance and dignity can never be defined by the clothes you wear, the job you hold, or the color of your skin. Arrogance will always blind the ignorant, but undeniable talent will eventually shatter every wall of prejudice. Never let anyone dictate your worth, and never be afraid to step up to the board and prove them wrong.